Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to you, wherever you are in the world as you join us for this session. My name is Jo Burgess, and I work for a small consulting company called Utilities. At the beginning of the pandemic, we set up something that we now call the Water Action Platform for immediate knowledge sharing and support between water utilities all over the world. And for the next hour, myself and my colleagues at Utilities and the World Bank will be telling you stories from the water sector about the effects of the pandemic on water and sanitation service providers and what steps they took to deal with them. I'm going to begin with a recap of the impacts. Then some of my colleagues from World Bank's Latin America team will present some information on financial impacts specifically and the tools that they developed to manage them. After that, my colleague Keris from ISLE will again introduce a program called Utility of the Future and talk about two cases of actions of resilience from Albania and the Philippines. And then finally, Yang from ISLE and Shona Fitzgerald from World Bank in Asia Pacific will connect the dots for all of us. And Gustavo Saltiel will give us our closing remarks. So let's get started. First, the headline impacts. Water demand changed. This graph shows you the average daily water consumption of a household in a developed country in litres per hour from midnight to midnight. And the orange line is before the pandemic. There's a peak between 8 and 9 in the morning when people get up and shower or bath, a trough when some people are in their workplaces, and then an evening peak due to bathing and cooking. The blue line is the post-pandemic pattern. The morning peak is later, about 10 a.m, because fewer people are commuting and going into workplaces. Consumption is higher all day due to there being more people at home and more of the sort of weekend cleaning and washing activities being done through the week. And then there's still an evening food preparation and bathing peak at around the same time. One of the most noticeable things was that during the pandemic or under lockdowns, there were no weekend peaks in domestic consumption. And this was because of weekend activities being carried out by those who weren't working during the week. When people were ordered to stay at home, the weekdays suddenly all looked like the demand pattern for holidays, when both places of work and schools were closed. This is important for utilities because in many parts of the world, industrial water consumers are on metered supplies, while domestic consumers aren't. So the utilities were supplying more water to homes overall, but not being paid for it. 40% of utilities experienced a reduction in commercial and industrial water demand overall, and half of them experienced an increase in household water demand. An average reduction of 27% was observed in industrial water demand. The same survey that these numbers came from reported that utilities around the world expect a reduction in revenues of 15% on average because of the pandemic. Despite the changes that were experienced, half of the utilities didn't change their total production level, and only 32% needed to decrease it. For some, that meant that the decrease in industrial water demand was almost completely offset by the increase in household water demand. So their production remained constant, and they just diverted more water to households or residential districts. But this increased non-revenue water through physical losses in the form of leaks or pilferage, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. So a couple of examples. In Johannesburg in South Africa, total water demand decreased by 5%, but because of the much higher number of domestic customers who aren't on meters, revenue decreased 48%. In Uganda, the National Water Corporation saw a drop in payment from March to May in 2020 from 80% revenue collection to only 20%. And this was because they weren't able to collect their payments in offices. Their business was primarily paper-based. This alone led to a 60% drop in income. What they did in response was implement a new web page, an app, and they introduced things like online payment processes. They also provided public campaigns, including door-to-door visits to explain how to read a meter. Implementing the app for payments and using that to replace paper bills paid in person at the municipal offices bounced that payment level back up to 50% by July 2020 and back up to 80% by November. So the increase in non-revenue water levels was attributed to both physical and commercial losses, so real or apparent losses. As I said a few minutes ago, reallocating more water volume to leakage-prone areas leads to more physical water losses. The suspension of meter reading may also increase discrepancies between actual and billed consumption, leading to increased commercial water losses. About 32% of water suppliers worldwide observed an increase in non-revenue water levels. The increase range was between 2 and 8%, and this was attributed to increases in unbilled consumption, metering and billing inaccuracies, unauthorized consumption, and leaks or bursts. Not surprisingly, a third of water suppliers fast-tracked pipe repairs to cope with the non-revenue water increases, and this was one of the few areas of project activity that actually sped up because of the pandemic. The rest of asset maintenance wasn't affected much. Our survey revealed that while 17% of utilities postponed ongoing or planned maintenance work, 83% of respondents didn't experience any significant delays in maintenance. There were typical adjustments in asset management, including changing the regime or methodology for asset condition assessment or performance assessment, and changes in product quality testing. However, capital projects were a different story. They were delayed. Construction work and the presence of large groups of workers on project sites was all suspended in all sectors under lockdown restrictions, and this halted a lot of construction activities upon lockdown enforcement. Where construction is dependent on migrant labourers, travel restrictions capped the available labour supply, and that added to the challenges of managing construction work or capital projects during lockdowns and quarantine periods. Aside from worker constraints, construction suspension has been common across all industries due to supply chain and logistics issues. This includes the disruption of supply chains for fuel, concrete, steel, soil, and in fact, all the construction inputs. Utilities around the world vary in their experiences of securing government approval to proceed with construction work as an essential activity. And the protocols on things like travel and gatherings for lengths of time vary from country to country and even regionally within countries. And this is the case for national policies that allowed for local government discretion on appropriate quarantine level, such as in the Philippines, the example that Keris spoke about. Although many governments allowed most construction activities to proceed after easing initial lockdowns, given precautionary measures like physical distancing, the impact on construction timelines is considerable. An Asian Development Bank survey, which is the source of this graph, revealed that close on 70% of the respondents anticipated a total delay in the end in completion of ongoing construction, with over 1/3 of respondents expecting a 3 to 6 month delay, and more than 20% are still uncertain on the impact on the construction timelines of the pandemic. So next, we're going to look at the financial impacts on water and sanitation service providers in Latin America specifically, and how to address them. And for that, I'm going to hand over to my colleagues at the World Bank team for water and sanitation in Latin America.
Latin America has suffered tremendously from COVID-19, both in terms of lives and livelihoods. The countries in the region saw heavy and strict lockdowns in 2020 in an effort to prevent the further spread of the disease. This complex context also had a direct financial impact on water and sanitation service providers. In response to demands from the client countries, the World Bank's water team in Latin America carried out an analytical work to assess the financial impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on water service providers in the region. Our aim was to understand the financial impact of the COVID crisis on the water utilities, identify the financial gap caused by the pandemic, and to provide recommendations for improving their financial health through close dialogue with policymakers and service providers. We wanted to contribute to the country's post-crisis recovery with a vision for sustainable and resilient water and sanitation service delivery. At the start of the pandemic, country governments, decision makers, regulators, and utilities quickly introduced new measures. As a first step, we therefore created an online monitoring dashboard of COVID response measures to keep track of publicly announced policy actions that were implemented by the countries in response to the pandemic. The aim of the measures were to secure the continuation of water and sanitation services for the population and to protect the service providers. Sector support measures were monitored and reported based on 5 key themes: which were observed more consistently in the region and had a larger financial impact on water supply and sanitation service providers. These 5 key measures were: 1. The deferral of water bills. 2. Forbidding service suspension. 3. Waiving bill payments for special groups. 4. Freezing tariff increases. And 5. Promoting remote bill payments and remote customer services. We also monitored utilities and received direct financial support from the governments. The second step was to carry out the financial impact assessment. The methodology for this was based on the application of an Excel-based simulation tool that the World Bank's Water Global Practice had developed. The intent of the tool was to use its results to help service providers articulate and demonstrate the short-term financing gap associated with the COVID-19 pandemic, and were needed to better justify claims for additional resources. The tool was designed to be user-friendly, to enable use by all types of service providers, but in cases where service providers already had financial models available that could capture COVID-19 impacts, those models were used to carry out the financial assessments. As the third step, once we had the results of the financial analysis, we explored the financial solutions that can minimize the impact of the shocks in the short run and improve the utilities' resilience towards future unexpected events. The sample of the study includes 25 utilities in 9 countries in the region, and the selection of utilities responded to country government demands.
What were the key findings of the assessment? We observed cross-cutting trends through the financial impact assessments, with impacts on water demand, water tariffs, operating and net results of utilities across the region, as well as on bill collection rates. First, residential water demand increased because more people stay at home, while non-residential water demand decreased significantly during the strict quarantines imposed in several countries in South America due to the closure of non-essential business such as offices and stores. These changes in residential and non-residential water use generally offset each other, resulting in only a slight increase in total water use. Second, reductions in non-residential water consumption translated into lower average water tariffs, a decrease in 2.7% on average. Third, the data suggests that the COVID-19 pandemic had a significant impact on the operating and net results of utilities across the region. The total losses due to COVID-19 pandemic in a sample of 20 utilities were estimated at $120 million in 2020. These losses represent 4.4% of the projected revenues of these companies for the same period. Reductions in EBITDA averaged 31.4% and peaked during the first months of the pandemic, particularly from April to May 2020. The average monthly contraction in net income was estimated at 39.2%, with April, May, and June registering the largest reductions. Finally, COVID-19 had a marked effect on the collection rates of utilities, which fell on average by 12.3% between March and December 2020. Changes in collection rates had an impact on utilities' liquidity. On average, cash flow decreased by 48.4%, with April being the worst month for the sample of utilities analyzed.
We have identified 3 key takeaways. First, the water and sanitation service providers prioritized day-to-day operations over maintenance and capital expenditures. This means that the service providers absorbed their operational shocks from the pandemic and adapted effectively to ensure that the services delivery was continued. But there's a risk that these short-term decisions of deferring maintenance could cause deterioration of assets. And deferred capital expenditures could also cause the countries to fall behind on their coverage goals and other SDG targets if no action is taken to fill the financing gap. Second, we found that the service providers with solid financial health and sound financial planning weathered the financial shocks better. The key lesson here is that sound financial planning, cash reserves, and availability of contingency funding can provide safety nets for the service providers to fall back on when they're going through short-term financial stress. And finally, our financial assessment highlights the need for the service providers to build financial resilience and be better prepared to absorb future shocks and mitigate liquidity risks. In doing so, it's very important that there's a proper policy, institutional, and regulatory environment in place, because we have found that good practices on financial planning are consistently linked to effective utility governance. We'll be presenting the recommendations and actions that we propose to our client countries in Latin America. But before doing that, we'll first delve into the general response and recovery actions that we've seen around the world. And this will be presented by Ceres van der Vijver, Head of Technology and Training of ISLE Utilities.
Muchas gracias por permitirnos en este espacio contarles el análisis que hemos hecho en las empresas afiliadas a Andesco del impacto por la pandemia del COVID-19 en los servicios de acueducto y alcantarillado en Colombia. Antes de iniciar, quiero contarles que Andesco es la Asociación Nacional de Empresas de Servicios Públicos y Comunicaciones, que agrupa empresas de telecomunicaciones, energía, gas, acueducto, alcantarillado, aseo y gestión de residuos sólidos, con un cubrimiento poblacional aproximado al 90% en las áreas urbanas y rurales del país. En nuestro país sabemos que hay unas coberturas muy importantes de acueducto de alcantarillado en las zonas urbanas. Nos falta una última brecha para llegar a la universalización, pero especialmente nuestra atención deberá estar centrada en la zona rural, en donde se presenta el principal rezago de coberturas en acueducto de alcantarillado. Frente a los prestadores, tenemos cerca de más de 2.000 prestadores en acueducto de alcantarillado en zonas urbanas, con 1.120 prestadores en acueducto y en alcantarillado 975. Respecto a las medidas implementadas en nuestro país para la atención del COVID-19, es importante señalar que estas se activaron desde marzo del 2020 a partir de la declaratoria de emergencia sanitaria, la cual emergencia que finaliza en el mes de agosto y que hace que algunas de estas medidas aún se encuentren vigentes. Dentro de las medidas que se implementaron, pues principalmente enfocadas a garantizar el acceso a los servicios de acueducto, no tener un impacto económico en estos servicios que restringieran, digamos, que los usuarios pudieran tener acceso a él, y también habilitar unas líneas de financiación o fuentes de financiación para los prestadores que no dejara en riesgo la prestación del servicio. Dentro de estas medidas tenemos la reconexión de usuarios suspendidos o cortados sin ningún costo para el usuario, en donde las empresas conectaron o reconectaron 303.000 usuarios con un costo aproximado de 50.000 millones que fueron cubiertas por las empresas de servicios públicos. También hubo una suspensión en los incrementos tarifarios durante todo el 2020, montos que fueron dejados de recibir por las empresas y que empezaron a habilitarse a partir del mes de diciembre con un plan gradual que tiene que ser cumplido por cada una de las empresas. Se habilitaron también financiación tanto para los usuarios como para las empresas prestadoras, el diferido de las facturas para los usuarios de los servicios de acueducto de manera obligatoria para los estratos 1 y 2, hizo que también se habilitara una línea de financiación para las empresas prestadoras, de manera de que los flujos dejados de percibir por ese diferido pues pudieran ser disponibles para las empresas con una financiación al 0%. Esto permitió que 113 empresas, alrededor del 10% de las empresas existentes de acueducto, pudieran acceder a esa línea de financiación. financiación. También por parte de las entidades territoriales, el pago de subsidios era una fuente muy importante para poder mantener el servicio, y el giro directo por parte de la nación para aquellas empresas que los municipios no hubieran dado el pago de manera oportuna, permitió que 57 municipios se le habilitara el giro directo y de esta manera poder la transferencia directa a las empresas prestadoras de servicios públicos. La implementación de protocolos de bioseguridad también fue una necesidad en nuestro sector. De acuerdo a la información que nos dieron nuestras empresas afiliadas, 29 empresas que implementaron estos protocolos tuvieron un costo de 2.500 millones de pesos. Todo esto, digamos que son impactos financieros para las empresas derivados de todas estas medidas y, por supuesto, de los efectos económicos de la pandemia. Para ello, desde Andesco hicimos un análisis el impacto de las medidas y cuáles, digamos, qué acciones tuvieron que adelantarse para continuar garantizando la prestación de los servicios públicos de acueducto de manera ininterrumpida. Para eso hicimos unos análisis de cifras sectoriales para evidenciar los impactos causados por la pandemia a partir de la información suministrada por 29 empresas de acueducto de alcantarillado que representan el 67 y el 72% del mercado respectivamente en nuestro país. Los dos principales impactos que podemos señalar y que aún se encuentran vigentes es el impacto en los ingresos que tienen las empresas para la prestación del servicio, especialmente reflejados en el recaudo. Por efecto de las medidas de aislamiento obligatorio, digamos que se vinieron dando durante todo el 2020, pues hubo un impacto en el recaudo de los recursos de las facturas de las que se generaron a los usuarios, especialmente crítico durante el periodo de abril y mayo, donde hubo las medidas más restrictivas de aislamiento y que a lo largo del año se vinieron, recuperando. Sin embargo, durante todo el 2020 tuvimos disminuciones de recaudo de hasta el 17% y llama la atención el efecto que esto ha venido dando hasta el 2021, en donde un primer análisis que hicimos de enero a abril nos da un impacto de hasta el 21% del recaudo. Esto no solamente derivado de las consecuencias económicas generadas por la pandemia, sino también porque aún continúa vigente la prohibición de suspensión del servicio por falta de pago. Esto efectivamente tiene un impacto en los ingresos de las empresas, pues al no contar con los recursos derivados de las tarifas que se cobran del servicio. Otro de los impactos que se han venido acumulando es el incremento de los usuarios morosos y de la cartera vencida. En marzo de 2020 hay un crecimiento exponencial en el número de usuarios morosos, donde pasamos de una media en el 2018 de 800.000 usuarios hasta 1.4 millones de usuarios que a mayo de 2020 no habían pagado su factura, y por lo tanto también un incremento de la cartera, en donde ya hemos llegado a cifras de hasta de 500.000 millones de pesos de facturas no pagadas, y que preocupa de alguna manera esa posibilidad de recaudo con el tiempo, al no poder hacer gestión comercial derivada de la prohibición de la suspensión. Entonces encontramos que no solamente ha habido un impacto para las empresas en términos económicos en el 2020, sino que también venimos arrastrando, que esas consecuencias en el presente año. Las empresas, en conclusión, para las medidas que se dieron en el sector y también los efectos de la pandemia del COVID-19, las empresas asumieron costos de reconexión, reinstalación de del servicio a suscriptores, el diferido de las facturas. Vemos que solo el 10% pudo acceder a esa línea de liquidez habilitada por el gobierno nacional, y los gastos de implementación de medidas de bioseguridad que no están siendo recuperados por ninguna fuente, sino que fueron a cargo directamente de las empresas. Acumulación activos de dudoso recaudo, pues por los efectos que se han venido acumulando esas facturas de no pago, que en la medida en que se van incrementando el tiempo en que no es posible hacer la suspensión del servicio, pues ese recaudo se vuelve dudoso y que está impactando negativamente la solidez financiera de las empresas. la baja o el bajo cubrimiento de las líneas de financiación, digamos digamos que solamente el 10% pudo acceder o cumplir con los requisitos que se habilitaron para esta línea, o también derivado de la necesidad de recursos y las demoras que se podían dar para poder acceder a esta línea y por lo tanto a los desembolsos. Y también pues todas estas medidas, a la acumulación de estos costos, la disminución de los recaudos, el incremento de la cartera, pues tiene un impacto en el flujo de caja de las empresas que se reflejan tanto en los ingresos como en su rentabilidad y por tanto aún tener que hacer un análisis de esa cartera de uso recaudo y el efecto que esa cartera puede tener en la liquidez de las empresas. Entonces, creemos que el principal efecto que tenemos hoy en día del COVID-19 es esa imposibilidad de no poder suspender o no poder hacer gestión comercial de estos morosos, y también no solamente el efecto que tiene ahora, sino también en la cultura de pago que puede tener para nuestro sector de muchos años que se ha venido trabajando para poder incrementar o tener indicadores positivos de recaudo. Muchas gracias.
Thank you so much, World Bank colleagues, for that presentation. And I'd like to now move on to the COVID response and recovery and just a general review of the water sector. I don't think any of us can really imagine 2 years ago looking and even preparing how such a pandemic would actually impact the world. It's unimaginable. But here we are in 2021, reflecting on the past 18 months and seeing how utilities have developed, changed and adapted in the way that we have all worked and interacted with customers. It's amazing, it really is, and we've come out of it on the other end. So in ISLE and the World Bank, we had a Utility of the Future project running as part of the World Bank programme to develop water companies around the world to become more resilient for the future. When we were preparing this 2 years ago, we were intending to meet face-to-face in all the different countries with all the different utilities, and we were going to be supporting their plans in person. But all this was put on hold. We adapted, we became agile, and we really actually benefited from the changes that we made so that we became a virtual platform, and we were discussing all the different aspects of becoming a utility of the future on this kind of platform. What it really did was, rather than do several journeys out there and sit with the utilities, we managed to do short, sharp meetings very frequently to review and drive progress within the utilities. This section will look at the challenges that appeared during the pandemic. We'll look at the resilience within utilities, and we will look at how they approached the short-term measures and also the long-term keepers, the long-term solutions. So let's look at just generally the challenges for the water sector during the pandemic. And first off was managing and protecting drinking water supplies, making and providing certainty to consumers that their drinking water was safe to drink and wholesome to drink. And then we looked at the wastewater aspects, making sure that the virus was not being returned to the environment, making sure that our workers were protected from the virus. And that leads me on to staff sickness and absence. And it was important to maintain a workforce that could deliver good, wholesome water and to take the wastewater away. It was also important to keep staff informed and to protect them, to keep the transmission risks low. And if a staff was identified with the virus, then how quickly could that staff member be isolated and all his colleagues who were operating with him? And then we look at the societal impacts. Well, varying demand for water. All offices were closed, people were sent home. We had to continue to supply greater amounts of water in different parts of the countries and areas and regions, because you didn't have people in offices, say, for instance, in the larger cities, and they were now more in the suburbs. And let's look at disruption from lockdown. There were lots. There were travel disruptions. There were import and export restrictions. There were things that were just not arriving. And some of this was critical for infrastructure and for delivering good, clean, wholesome drinking water and to take it away. So we'll look at the resilience in water utilities. And we really did have a fantastic insight into how the utilities that we were working with through the Utility of the Future project actually adapted and how they were very resilient in this absolute global pandemic. And to showcase this, I've selected a couple of case studies, one from Albania and one from the Philippines, who we were working with, as I mentioned. But before I go on to the case studies, I'd just like to mention about the definition of a utility of the future. This is what the countries and the utilities we were working with were striving to achieve. And it's a future-focused utility which provides reliable, safe, inclusive, transparent and responsive water supply and sanitation services to all through best fit practices that allow it to operate in an efficient, resilient and sustainable manner. And there's no better definition than during and post-pandemic. The success of becoming a utility of the future is measured in this pyramid and the circle around it. If you look at the pinnacle of that pyramid, you can see there that it mentions service to customers. And that is the ultimate objective, is to service the customers that are drinking the water and are providing the wastewater to be taken away. And then underneath that are the building blocks to achieve the service to customers. And it does depend on effective technical and efficient commercial operations, together with the organization and strategy of the company, the human resource aspects, and the financial management. And we were calculating with the utilities how good they were in these areas. Underpinning all that is the legal framework and governance. And then if you look at the outside, the orange circle, this is talking about the characteristics that can improve as utilities become utilities of the future or drive towards the utilities of the future. And in here, we were looking at how innovative those utilities were, whether they had good inclusion policies, what were the market and customer orientation, and what was the resilience of that water company. And these are the companies that we worked with. And each one had to score how they were today. So benchmarking where they are today. And then they were looking at their risk appetite and their appetite for becoming the utility of the future and scoring where they wanted to go. And these 8 countries with 10 utilities we were working with, we're going to do just that. We're going to focus on Korce and Manilad. Now, if you look at Korce in Albania, you can see that they have some orange on the outside of their circle. The more orange it is, the closer they are to achieving becoming utility of the future. And so this is where they are, and in the future, over the next 3 to 10 years, they will develop even further. But the point of this presentation is to look at the resilience of them and where they really did find it challenging and how they overcome those challenges to continue to deliver 24/7 water to their customers and take their wastewater away. If you look at operationally, how they had to adjust. Well, in March 2020, they made big working shift pattern changes. They made sure that the same people were bubbled together. They sent administrative people home to work from home. And all credit to them, there was no loss of supply during the pandemic. A few months later, they brought people back into the offices, but they also informed all their employees that if anybody had any illness, they were sent home, along with their close working contacts. The absence increased somewhere in the region of between 30 and 35%. But they did manage to apply all COVID-19 rules in all offices and working practices. The capital works suspended. They had to suspend, and they prioritized only the really high risk investments to continue. Everything else was delayed. And the focus on accurate delivery of operation and maintenance to maintain service in rural areas was key. Then move on to customer management. So what changed? Well, the customer service office actually closed for 3 weeks in March and opened back up with reduced staff. Well, what happened to the customers? Well, the customers actually managed to pay online and do other things online. They provided information to customers via social media, telephone, and told them how they could adapt their payment methods. All this meant that there was somewhat less income coming into that business. So they focused and changed the way that they operate. They put a lot of emphasis in collecting debt after about 6 months of the COVID pandemic continuing. And to be honest, they've actually collected more years because the focus has been on there, the measurement has been on there, and the reporting has been on there. So there's been a big increase in the amount that they have actually recouped on their debt. You can see there that 70% of customers were paying their invoices at Customer Relations Office, 30% were paying their invoice via alternative ways. Well, today, 50% are paying by alternative ways, which is a big change. If we move on to, you can see there that their scores on the doors on the inside on how they have achieved excellence in organizational strategy, human resources, and the other areas need a little bit of action plans to achieve improvement. Again, the outside orange circle shows that they are fairly resilient, but there are the white parts on the outside ring show that there's areas where they could improve. And here again, we have got, before the lockdown, the mission was and their strategy was to look at continuing to deliver good, wholesome water and to take their wastewater away and to ensure the safety of employees and create flexible guidelines. And they did start putting in working from home arrangements, which is great. But during lockdown, their focus started to change, and the main impacts were making sure that the health and safety was paramount and that their workers were safe. And they limited HR activities. There was a reduction in the revenue, and there were billing complaints by customers. It was expected because there was less people working on this to collect the revenues and less to address any complaints in a timely manner. Many plant operators, which I must say is commendable, volunteered to stay in the water and wastewater treatment facilities where they worked, away from families for the 3-month lockdown. I think that's commendable. And Maninland also negotiated and worked with governments to grant essential work status that allowed for the people, the employees, to deliver critical services. After the lockdown, there was a review, and there has been partnership with the local hospital to ensure that all employees are fast-tracked for screening and testing. The work re-entry follows strict health protocols and only after preparing physical offices, so that they, for instance, put in plastic barriers, one-way corridors, extra sanitation stations. And now Maniland is considering which guidelines will continue to be implemented, which ones are the keepers even after the pandemic. What is the new normal? Things like continued working from home, additional electronic channels for customer payments, for customer complaints, etc. And just to summarize what I said on those case studies, the key learnings: it pays to be prepared. Contingency plans, but I don't think anybody could have foreseen how big this pandemic was globally. Be decisive, flexible, and agile is so important. Change depending on regulations. Communicate clearly, both with workers and with staff and with customers, and listen to those that are actually doing the work on the ground, because they know what's happening, how dangerous it is or how not so dangerous it is, and learn to adapt. So finally, some lessons learned. Over-reliance of a centralized system can breed single points of failure. Long-term resilience requires flexibility, redundancy, and alternatives. The recommendation is not to break up the centralized system into pockets of independent, fully decentralized systems. Rather, service providers must assess the risks and opportunities where decentralization can add value to operational efficiency and long-term sustainability. Water sector services must be designed for sustainability and long-term resilience. And look, we have come a long way with digital technologies. Let's garner that way of working and pay significant attention to it. Let's see how we can keep that and have a hybrid way of working. The pandemic has provided greater impetus for digital transformation, and it's brought along the way that we work 10 years ahead of where we could have been. So in a way, that is a definite plus. Thank you very much for listening. I'm going to hand over to our next presenter, Shona.
Thank you, Keris, for starting the conversation about resilience. I want to talk in a bit more detail about what a resilient water utility looks like in the face of this pandemic. And to do that, I want to ask this question: what has COVID-19 exposed? What has it shown us about the water sector's vulnerabilities, and what does resilience look like in response to those vulnerabilities? Firstly, equality. It's shown us that if one part of society is at risk of COVID-19, the whole of society is at risk of COVID-19. In Cape Town, South Africa, the city of Cape Town recognised that those living in informal settlements were most at risk. And so in response, they provided emergency drinking water via tankers for 14,000 households. Moratoriums on disconnection and suspensions on billing were also common across the world. We see that a resilient water utility meets the needs of all its citizens and ensures that the most vulnerable can access and afford services. The pandemic has shown us that technology is no longer optional. In Bangladesh, Dhaka Wasa introduced a new mobile banking system called bCash for consumers to pay bills online. Pamjaya in Jakarta, Indonesia, saw the opportunity to automate their water network. A resilient utility uses technology to ensure continuity of services through operations and billing, but also through enabling their staff to work from home. The utility also seeks innovation within their technological constraints. For example, a utility may not have extensive SCADA network, but they may be able to use technology to better communicate with customers. Communication, communication, communication. In Ceará, Brazil, the water and sanitation utility formed a crisis committee that was a central point of communication internally and with the government. Other service providers, we saw increased communication with customers through television, radio, social media, SMS, newspapers, letters. Globally, utilities shared experiences, such as through the Water Action Platform. Communication is essential at all levels. A resilient utility uses communication to reflect and learn from its own and others' experiences, to coordinate effectively internally and externally, in particular with governments and health authorities, and it engages communities through varied communication channels. COVID-19 exposed financial vulnerability of utilities when revenues declined very quickly, and the response was varied. The water utility in Karachi, Pakistan, for example, received 60% subsidy of operating costs from government, but other utilities had to draw on financial reserves where they were available. It was seen that the most financially resilient utilities were those that had sound financial planning and were able to access cash reserves or contingency funds. Moreover, the resilient utility fully resources business continuity plans so that the responses are deployed quickly and efficiently. COVID-19 has exposed so much about systems, business systems, governance systems, regulation, tariff, networks, supply chains. We've heard an example from Mainland Water in the Philippines about the success of their business systems, their preparedness, their business continuity. And it was underpinned by leadership and a vision which was so strongly aligned with the employees that some of them chose to live on site at the treatment plants during the lockdown. Systems underpin all of these elements I've spoken about: equality, technology, communication, financing. They are all underpinned by factors that enable resilience. When it comes to systems, we've seen that a resilient utility balances redundancy with efficiency. In terms of infrastructure, yes, but also in terms of resourcing and supply chain. We've seen that a resilient utility is prepared and considers and even influences the external factors such as the regulatory environment. Building on these ideas about what a resilient utility looks like in the face of COVID, I'm now going to hand over to Yang Villa to walk us through an example of how one utility has fostered this resilience in building resilient systems through considering external factors. Over to you, Yang.
Thank you, Shauna. To further our understanding of utility resilience, I want to present the case study of Timor-Leste. In particular, let's look at the external factors that enable and sustain utility resilience. Timor-Leste is not only the youngest nation state in Southeast Asia, it also recently established the newest national utility in the region. Timor-Leste, or BTL, was established just last September 2020 as the country's single utility body. Under the World Bank's Utility of the Future program, ISLE had the privilege of helping BTL draft its very first business plan. We quickly realized that aside from realizing BTL's internal plans, it is crucial to design an enabling environment that would support BTL's long-term success and resilience. I'd like to share now 3 key insights from this experience. First, it is important to have a clear institutional setup. The creation of BTL represents an opportunity for large-scale water sector reform in Timor-Leste. Such reform must answer questions such as, who is monitoring what? Is there an overlap in regulatory oversight and responsibility? What's missing in the government landscape? The importance of institutional setup can be seen in the neighboring country of the Philippines, where I am actually based. Here we have over 30 government agencies that govern the water sector, a recipe for bureaucracy and confusion. Long-term resilience requires a concerted effort from all stakeholders, which can best be achieved by having a well-designed and streamlined institutional landscape. Second, regulation must be geared towards resilience. We are all familiar with service level obligations for operations. We know about key performance indicators, or KPIs, such as service coverage ratio, NRW level, and collection efficiency rate. But what standards or KPIs do we have to measure resilience? We must remember that it is difficult to manage what we do not measure. Embedding resilience within the utility must be supported by a regulatory framework that makes resilience a priority rather than an afterthought. Last April, tropical cyclone Seroja caused devastating floods and landslides in Timor-Leste. Climate change is expected to make such events more frequent and severe. Regulating for utility resilience must look at both extremes, too little water on the one hand or too much on the other. Regulation must look at long-term resilience as a matter of now, with incentives for investments in resilient operations and infrastructure that can withstand unprecedented shocks. Finally, Timor-Leste is pushing for tariff reform that would enable financial sustainability. BTL has inherited a tariff structure that has remained the same over the last 17 years. Coupled with low collection efficiency, this results in low revenues. In the medium term, BTL is aiming to achieve partial cost recovery with revenues sufficient to pay for at least its operating expenses. Financial sustainability is crucial for resilience on so many levels. It ensures that all critical operations such as asset management and maintenance, as well as network expansion of the pipe and sewer network are fully funded. Being financially resilient also means that BTL can have autonomy and independence in decision-making, which is an important characteristic of a mature utility. To achieve this, BTL's external stakeholders, such as regulators and financiers, must support BTL's roadmap towards financial resilience. Clear institutional setup, regulation for resilience, and tariff reform. These three external factors can make or break the Timor-Leste utility's earnest effort towards long-term resilience. Now, let's take a closer look at financial resilience, and for that, our World Bank colleagues have developed a financial tool.
The study found that financial resilience can be built by adopting some good practices, both at the water utility level and also at the government level. At the utility level, we found that it's important to systematically track the service provider's operational and financial information to enable more accurate and reliable financial planning. Other good practices include creation of internal emergency funds, adoption of digital monitoring and operational technologies, and implementation of risk management plans. At the government level, it is important to create a proper policy and regulatory framework to promote good utility governance. In containing the short-term liquidity shocks, we propose a liquidity facility or a credit line to be established so that the service providers can access emergency funds quickly. To plan for longer-term financial resilience building, we propose exploring other financial mechanisms, such as the parametric insurance. Building the utility's creditworthiness to enable access to commercial financing would also contribute to making the water sector to be more financially resilient. The World Bank looks forward to contributing towards improving financial resilience in the water and sanitation sector, and by helping utilities apply the needed financial resilience building practices and financial tools to help mitigate the impacts of shocks and crises in the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I would like to take this opportunity to thank all the participants and speakers who made this session possible, including our partners with whom we have collaborated to develop the material presented today. Thank you, AIL Utilities, CAF, and ANDESCO, the Colombian National Association of Public Service Companies. Above all, I would like to extend my appreciation to the SIWI facilitators and speakers for making this a World Water Week to remember. As the World Bank's global lead for water supply and sanitation, I have had the opportunity to be part of the bank's Water Global Practice initiative to support our clients from different regions and countries throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. As soon as the virus started to spread across the globe, we quickly realized the importance of supporting the water utilities who were making the heroic effort of continuing water and sanitation service delivery, but also as a critical line of defense against the virus. Early on in the pandemic, we saw that water and sanitation utilities had to quickly learn how to do more with less revenues, challenges with supply chains, less staff on site, less freedom of movement, less interaction with customers. At the World Bank, we focused on supporting the sector in three priority areas. First, safe water supply, sanitation and hygiene, and safe medical waste management. Second, communication and preparedness related to hand washing behavior change and hygiene promotion. And third, critical interventions to support utilities to maintain safe access to water and sanitation services. As such, in early stages of the pandemic, the Water Global Practice of the World Bank engaged with clients to provide just-in-time support for the emergency response and later in the preparation of recovery plans under the principles of building back better and a green, resilient and inclusive development, what we call GREET. As we have heard, our utilities also responded early on by creating what has become the Water Action Platform, a forum for the sharing of learning and best practice on COVID-19 related actions across the water sector. The platform reaches 745 people from 395 organizations across 64 countries. Through the Water Action Platform and the World Bank's responses, we saw significant shifts in the water sector, including changes in water demand, reduction in revenues, increasing in non-revenue water, and delays in capital projects. Today's session has highlighted some of the responses, including through client demand-driven analytical work across Latin America and the Caribbean, and through the Utility of the Future framework to support utilities to develop forward-looking and resilient short and long-term plans. The analytical work presented in this session is the summary of the whole Global Water Team's collective effort to support our clients over the past 18 months since the COVID-19 pandemic outbreak. The work was initiated in response to the demand from water utilities and governments who were in need to urgently respond to COVID-related emergencies, including improving access to wash services. Leveraging on our close relationship with clients through ongoing operations, we started by documenting immediate COVID measures and a pilot analysis of a few utilities that expanded as the demand increased to cover more than 25 utilities in 9 countries over the course of the year. Also, the bank team initially focused on promoting the use of a liquidity facility to provide quick disbursing funds to help the utilities with their short-term financing needs, and over time we learned that longer-term financial mechanisms would be needed as we found that utilities were deferring important capital expenditures to cover for existing funding gaps. Through engaging and supporting utilities using the Utility of the Future framework, we have seen some of the key factors that facilitate utility resilience that include business preparedness is crucial, and we have an opportunity now to take the time to reflect on the successes and failures of preparedness during the pandemic and develop stronger business continuity and emergency response plans for the future. In a global crisis, there is a need to be connected and collaborative, to learn from one another, and for this, to assist utilities to be agile in responding to the needs on the ground. The Water Action Platform created by IL Utilities is an excellent example of an effective collaborative approach. Resilience needs to consider people, places, and processes, which means good two-way customer communication and participation, planning and designing infrastructure with adaptability and redundancy, embracing digital and innovative solutions, ensuring resilience through business strategy and planning processes, ensuring financial sustainability, and considering external factors including regulation and tariff reform. Before wrapping up, I would like to point you to several knowledge products that have been developed and presented today and that are publicly available. An emergency response and recovery framework to support utilities throughout the different phases of the pandemic. Second, a generic financial model to quantify the financial impact of COVID on the water utilities. It was developed for use by the utilities to justify their request for government funding, to fill the liquidity gap, or regulatory decisions to compensate for the losses. Third, a working paper that describes the factors to consider when developing the financial facilities to support water utilities in the COVID-19 crisis, as we believe that quick disbursing facilities would be required to mitigate the utilities' liquidity problems. And finally, the report Building Financial Resilience, Lessons Learned from the Early Impact of COVID-19 on Water and Sanitation Service Providers in Latin America, which describes several mechanisms that can be available to the water sector to improve its financial resilience. I would like to share with you all this information and let you know that all the reports mentioned on the Utility of the Future program you can find in the link attached in the chat. Ultimately, the work conducted by utilities and the World Bank Water Global Practice points out that the experience from the COVID-19 pandemic can be used to build back better and improve the capacity of water utilities around the world to be ready to handle any shocks, including natural disasters and other crises. We would therefore like to highlight that we are ready to continue supporting our clients and partners through the Utilities of the Future program by continuing to offer the financial impact assessment support or by operationalizing the recommendations that we have been presenting through the session today. We look forward to continuing to joining forces with other key actors in the water sector. Thank you very much.